Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another Sega Saturn review. With us today revisiting a game that I have previously taken a look at in the past several years ago in the form of Hardcore 4x4, an off-road racing game that saw release on the PlayStation, the PC and the Saturn, with the Saturn version first coming out in December of 1996 in North America and the PAL regions, and then coming out in May of 1997 over in Japan. So many people may be aware that I did take a look at Hardcore 4x4 as one of the first ever reviews in my series, and it's also featured in a Saturn versus PlayStation video, so it's getting a rare third opportunity to try and impress me in terms of look, sound, gameplay, content and lifespan, and ultimately whether it's still worth playing today and has the quality somehow to make our Saturn PAL or worldwide top 10s. So once you hit the main menu, you've got a choice of start and options. Heading into options lets you change the volume for the sound effect and the music. Whether you want commentary on or off, you can also change the steering sensitivity and choose between whether you want the cartridge or the memory to be your save state. And you can check the control pad configuration and view the credits as well. So once you hit the main menu, you've got my first gripe with the game, and that is the fact that the main menu is not set out very well at all. It's simply got pictures, and you have to then click on each one to realize what that setting is. Yes, some of them are self-explanatory, but it makes the game overly cumbersome and more frustrating than it needs to be. Once you're on the vehicle selection screen, you'll see you've got a choice of 6 vehicles with varying statistics. There is one additional vehicle that you can unlock by completing the championship or by inputting a code. There are 6 tracks within the game as well, and you've got a choice of time trial, single race and championship mode as well. It's worth pointing out though, it is only a 1-player game. So like always, I'm going to start with visuals first, and I'm afraid I have to address the most overwhelmingly negative part of the game straight away, and of course I'm talking about the frame rate. As soon as you load up your first race, it is noticeable straight away that this game runs terribly. I would hazard a guess that when there are 6 cars racing around the track, it probably runs at about 15 FPS. That is slightly higher when there's only 1 truck going around the course, but of course the main bulk of the game is you racing against 5 other competitors. It really is an overwhelmingly negative part of the game. It's hard to stress how bad it is. I would hazard a guess that it's probably the worst running racing game on the entire console, and in fact it's probably one of the worst running games in general. Now, it's not all completely negative because the texture work in the game is actually relatively decent. It's perfectly acceptable for the time period that the game came out, and actually the draw distance isn't that bad either. The pop-up that there is relatively well hidden by the designs of the courses because they're constantly twisting and turning. There are hills, there are trees, and it actually masks most of the pop-up relatively well. Yes, you will see a bit from time to time. Yes, it is a little bit glitchy, but it's not as bad as some other racing games we've seen on the system. The vehicles, whilst they're not spectacular and they're not overladen with detail, they're relatively passable for a 1996 racing game. The mesh effect shadows on the game aren't too bad either because they're really only just underneath the vehicles for the main part of the game, at least anyway. But there are some more negative points as well. There is a fair bit of glitching in the game, polygons disappearing in the corners of the screen when you race around the track. Also, trucks completely losing chunks of their bodies when they're close to yours from time to time. And of course, probably the second most overwhelmingly negative part of the game, the weather effects, because they are absolutely diabolical in this game. They are really, really bad. I would much rather have had no weather effects in the game than the ones we've got present. When there is snow going on in races, it is absolutely hideous. It hinders the performance and it hinders the gameplay as well. Racing around at night time as well is not particularly enjoyable because it can be quite hard to navigate around the courses because of course there is no map overlay for this game either. Another negative point of view. Now of course it's very difficult to say anything positive really about the game in terms of visuals. If you are buying this game based on still screenshots, you might think that it looks okay and that it might run okay as well. But of course, as soon as you load up the game and you witness what you've got here, the visual experience with Hardcore 4x4 is very, very painful. So moving on to sound effects and music next, and Hardcore 4x4 doesn't perform particularly well in this area either. We've got a commentator who is very similar to the one we saw in Destruction Derby a few weeks back, and very similar to that game. He doesn't offer anything to the experience of this game. When he does speak, he feels quite forced and is generally quite irritated. So my advice would be to simply turn him off. In terms of the sound effects of the vehicles, they're not particularly impressive either, because I feel like they should be louder, they should be more aggressive and grunty, and they're not. You do get some smashing sounds when you hit the scenery and stuff, but again, they actually make your vehicle sound like it's going to completely fall apart, and they don't necessarily fall in line with what's going on the screen. I think the sound effects overall just aren't particularly good. Now, in regards to the music, that's probably the highlight of this area, because we've just got some very passable generic rock tunes. They are quite samey in all fairness, but they do their job. They're simply there to be background noise, and they do that relatively well. That's pretty much the most positive thing I can say, because they're not memorable. You're not going to be humming them after you turn the game off, but they're there nonetheless. And what of course I will do is give you some examples of them right now. So moving on to the gameplay next, I'm going to say something here that I've said several times in the past before, and that is, for as bad as a game looks and as poor as it runs, or as drab and mundane as it sounds, it can be saved in terms of its gameplay. If it delivers an enjoyable experience when you're playing it, the game can still be pretty decent overall, and I always hark back to the example of Mystaria, the Realms of Lore, because it does fall into this category very well. But unfortunately for Hardcore 4x4, it plays even worse than it looks and runs, because this is one hell of an unresponsive, frustrating mess of a game to play. In terms of its controls, they're pretty simple: accelerate, brake and turn. You can change your camera view. You even get 3 nitro boosts to use in each race, but controlling the truck is an absolute nightmare because it's so unresponsive and laggy. It's going to bring you very, very limited enjoyment. And obviously when you go onto the courses that are in the night or with weather effects going on, they're even more difficult to play through. It's a very, very frustrating experience overall. Speaking of the camera views, if you decide to go for a first-person view or the viewpoint from inside the truck, there's a possibility that you'll get motion sickness because you are bouncing around uncontrollably. It's pretty strange, it's pretty disorientating, and it may well affect some people in terms of their health. It really is that bad. It's difficult to point out any positives really in terms of the way it plays, because I really don't think there are any. Doesn't really matter which truck you control either, because they're all just as uncoordinated and unresponsive as each other. It really is the worst playing racing game that I have played on the Saturn. So moving on to content and lifespan next, and thankfully I can say the game is fairly respectable in this area. There is only one criticism, and that's the fact it doesn't have a 2-player split screen, although if that was implemented into the Saturn version, I dread to think how that would perform. Now in terms of a 1-player game, we've got 7 trucks, we've got 6 tracks, we've got single race, time trial and championship, and if you win the championship on the easier difficulties, you can unlock harder difficulties too. We've got day and night racing, and we've obviously got different weather effects going on as well, so there's actually a fairly respectable amount of content for a 1996 racer. It certainly falls in line with what was on offer in a lot of the other racing games from that time period too. You have to remember we hadn't had the next generation of racing games yet. Gran Turismo hadn't come along and completely transformed what we could expect within a racing game. So in terms of content and lifespan, Hardcore 4x4 is actually an okay game. Now, of course, that leaves me with my final questions. Is Hardcore 4x4 a game that I could still recommend that you go and play in this day and age? Has my perception of the game completely changed and seen it jump into my Saturn PAL or worldwide top 10s? Or is it still lingering in my Saturn bottom 10? Well, in terms of whether it's worth playing, not on the Saturn it's not, because it's an absolute shocker. It runs a lot better on the PlayStation, to be fair, although it's still a very average racing game at best on that system. In terms of is it going to feature in our top 10s, of course not. It's one of the worst games I've looked at, which is why it still sits very well placed in my Saturn bottom 10 as number 7, the 7th worst game that I have looked at so far, in my opinion, on the Saturn. Of course, there's every chance it's going to stay in there for the entire duration of my review series. I'm going to have to play some real stinkers for it to be displaced from my Saturn bottom 10. But of course, these are just my thoughts on the game and my thoughts alone. A few people have commented in the past, especially when I took a look at it on the Saturn versus PlayStation series, that they actually played the Saturn version and enjoyed it. Now, I find that hard to believe because this didn't bring me any enjoyment playing it for my review. But of course, if your opinions are different to mine, let me know with a comment down below. And like always, I'll be back in the near future with another review in my Saturn series. Goodbye for now.